Corla. Minister, John did extremely well in his Leaving Cert. He got his first choice in his CEO offer. He's the first member of his family to go to college. He did computer science in DIT from County Roscommon. But John had to drop out before Christmas due to the spiralling cost of accommodation that his landlord was charging and the lack of student accommodation in the city of Dublin. He was receiving the highest rate, the additional top-up grant in relation to student support, but he couldn't afford to remain in college because the rents in Dublin city centre are on average €600, which is 100% more expensive than comparable accommodation in the city of Galway. And I want to know what's going to be done about this.
Minister.
From my department's examination of this matter, there is no correlation between where a student is from and his or her likelihood of being awarded a grant. There are a variety of factors which impact on the number of student grant awards in any academic year. These include, but are not limited to, the number of applications, the number of transitioning from second level to third level, the number of mature students entering the system for the first time or re-entering after a break in study, increases in population in a particular age cohort or area, be it rural or urban, economic circumstances or developments in a particular area, financial circumstances of individuals and their parents, and increases in third level participation generally. The aim of the Student Maintenance Grant Scheme has always been to make a contribution to the cost of going to college. Covering the full cost has never been a feasible option. Now, I realise from what you've said that your main issue is around the cost of accommodation. I have actually answered earlier on today, but I can come back to you on that. In terms of the issue of the cost of accommodation, it is a particular issue in the Dublin area and indeed to some extent in Galway as well. But you know, it is one that the government is addressing.
Thank you, Deputy Denis Naughten.
No, Minister, it's a broader issue. Accommodation is a problem, but you know, both you and your colleagues were tripping over each other to welcome the fact earlier this year when the statistics were published that there were more PAYE families now receiving the higher education grant and less farmers and the self-employed. Of course, what was failed to be recognised, and maybe you might acknowledge it here, is that there's a larger cohort of PAYE workers in cities, and there's a larger cohort of farmers and self-employed in rural areas. And the reality is, Minister, and would you not acknowledge the fact that it is now far more difficult for people in rural areas to access education in the cities because of the cost of accommodation, because of the lack of accessible transport? And would you not acknowledge the fact, Minister, that despite the fanfare that there are more PAYE workers, sons and daughters, now accessing higher education grants, the overall numbers of people that are actually in receipt of the grant has dropped, even though the numbers going to college has actually increased. So the proportion that are accessing the grant is less.
Minister.
Well, first of all, there is absolutely no discrimination between people living in rural Ireland and people living in urban Ireland with regard to access to the grant scheme. I mean, you could be living in a town or a city and you still may have to pay for accommodation for higher education. So it doesn't just apply to people who live in rural areas. The cost of accommodation is an issue for people in a variety of different geographical situations. And I mean, despite the difficulties and the economic difficulties, we have managed to maintain the grants in recent years. And as I said in my opening response, I mean, the grants were never intended nor ever could cover all of the cost of going to college. And can I just add, because you cited a particular case, that there are, as you know, funds within the higher education institutions that can be applied for as well if there is a fear that somebody is going to drop out because of lack of money.
Thank you. Deputy Denis Naughten.
Minister, John did drop out, and there are many more Johns across this country at the moment who are forced into a situation because they cannot, and their families cannot afford to keep them in college and pay for accommodation. And yes, the higher education grant has been maintained, Minister, but the difficulty is that the cost of accommodation is going through the roof. And the reality is that the vast majority of people who have to access accommodation are off the bus routes. As you know, a lot of the bus routes are being closed down by Bus Éireann, which makes it even less accessible to commute. But they are people who are outside the urban centres, who are outside the major towns where they have access to institutes of technology and have to rely on commuting or residing in Dublin. And what we have in reality now, because the higher education grant has not kept in line with the increase in the cost of accommodation, the cost of increasing cost of going to college, we have effectively education apartheid by geography.
Thank you.
And what I want to know is, Minister, what are you going to do about that?
Minister, to conclude.
Well, first of all, there's limited money, Deputy Naughten. I don't know if you're proposing that when any increased money we would get, we would put it into student grants, because you've got other competing interests, as you know. You have people looking for extra guidance teachers to go back into schools. You have people looking for extra capitation. You have people looking for a reduction in class size. There are a whole lot of areas where we are under pressure to spend money. Now, we have, I think, managed to retain the grant scheme by and large, despite the economic downturn. And we're going to have to make very difficult choices. And there isn't any discrimination, as I said, in relation to rural Ireland versus urban Ireland in terms of access to grants, or indeed in relation to accommodation. And as I say, there are very many people who don't live near enough to their college anyway to live at home, whether they're in urban Ireland or rural Ireland. The issue of accommodation I have addressed already, but just to say to you that, I mean, you know, the government has significantly increased the amount of money in the whole area of housing, and we've made a significant announcement in terms of housing in general this year, despite the economic difficulties, and we will continue to do that. And student accommodation is part of, and I mentioned that there's a strategic investment fund is one area where there may be funding for student accommodation, and I have engaged directly with the higher education institutions in terms of providing student accommodation themselves for their